Hi everyone, my name is Faith Linton. I'm a junior studying biology here, and I'm going to just give a little overview of Taiwan history and our family's also involvement in the politics of Taiwan. But first I want to share some scenery pics with you. Taiwan is beautiful. You can kind of just like go through them, but when the Portuguese first came to Taiwan in the 1400s, they called her Taiwan Ilha Formosa, which means beautiful island, and that's where Taiwan got the name Formosa. So Taiwan has beautiful beaches and also beautiful mountains. And this is actually my hometown, Ilan. It is on the coast, and this is called Turtle Island. It's a pretty famous island off the coast. And this is the rice fields. This is the same house. And a lot of the rice fields in the winter time, they're flooded, and they let it sit fallow for a while, and then they flood it, and then they plant rice seedlings in it, and then the rice grows in the field, and it looks like that. This is an aerial view of my same hometown in the countryside. See, there's a lot of development, but also still a lot of rice fields, and just always mountains in the back. Okay, so Taiwan has three main languages: Taiwanese, Mandarin Chinese, and Hakka. Taiwanese is the heart language. It is very different from Chinese, Mandarin Chinese. It is much more complex. It's an older language, and it is has much more depth of expression. Mandarin is a modern language that's lost a lot of that. So Taiwanese, all these sentences say "I love Taiwan." So in Taiwanese, that's 我爱台湾, and then in Chinese it's 我爱台湾. And in Hakka, this is a third people group. It's a much smaller one, and not as many people say it. I don't know how to speak Hakka, but my friend taught me this. So this is Ngai Oi Toi Van, which is Hakka for I love Taiwan. There are also 12 extant Austronesian tribes. Austronesian means Southern Islander, and just basically Aboriginals related to the Polynesians in Hawaii and in Maori. In fact, many people think that linguists, geneticists, and just many people think that Taiwan is the original homeland of the Maori and of just the Polynesian people in the Easter Islands, and New Zealand, and Hawaii. And these are the 12 distinct different languages for each tribe. So this is the book that I drew a lot of organized content of what I'm going to say from. So I highly recommend it. I actually have it with me, so if you want to borrow it, you can sign up and I'll let you look at it. But and all the pictures, the historical pictures in this presentation come from the Tsunha Foundation, which is a pro-Taiwan democracy, human rights activism foundation. Actually, my grandparents helped to start. So, okay, so this is way back when no one really knew what Taiwan was. So right now, I'm going to go back to the 1600s. At that time, it was only mainly pirates, merchants, or the same thing, who were using Taiwan as just like a base. Also, all the Austronesian tribes were in Taiwan at that time, back in the 1600s. And at that time, the Dutch were trying to get a trade base with China. And so they worked out an agreement with the Ming Dynasty, which was the dynasty at the time that was over the imperial dynasty in China at the time, that they could occupy part of Taiwan, just because Taiwan was just like this island there that just was very convenient. So the Dutch came and they actually occupied the western portion of Taiwan, and they did trade there, and many of them were Protestant Christians who actually did a lot of missionary work there, and so they would, instead of like a lot of people think of colonists as like forcing their culture. They actually try to integrate into Taiwanese culture. And they translated, for example, books in the Bible into, they developed a Latin orthography for the Austronesian languages and translated some of that, the Bible into that. And that's actually super important for the preservation of those languages now because we have those translations. Okay, so, you can go to the next slide. So, Qing Dynasty. Meanwhile, the Ming Dynasty was slowly being taken over by a foreign empire, the Manchurian Empire. And the Manchus, they basically expanded their territory all the way over to Mongolia and Tibet, and established the Qing Dynasty. And okay, so the story goes, so there was a pirate king, you know, like Pirates of the Caribbean, there's like a pirate king that actually decided, he kind of fled from the Ming Dynasty, and he came to Taiwan, and he decided he wanted to set up his empire there. And he did, he took over part of it. His ultimate goal was to invade and kick out the Spanish in the Manila, Philippines. And he didn't actually end up doing that because within a year of establishing like a kingdom in Taiwan, he was bit by a mosquito and he got malaria and he died. But because of that pirate king that was in Taiwan, the Qing Dynasty was kind of like keeping an eye out. They like didn't really like that he was there. And so they decided they were gonna just come and just kind of have people representatives in Taiwan take over, have a very passive approach to Taiwan, but just kind of make sure everything was kept in bay there. And so during that time, a lot of, there were still a lot of pirates in Taiwan, a lot of merchants. Again, the pirates and the merchants were basically the same people that like would switch. And also the Austronesians were still there. And a lot of people came over from Fujian province and like different areas. They came to Taiwan for basically a new life. There's a lot of agriculture there, and just if they wanted to just have a better life, they moved to Taiwan and kind of established. And that was kind of the beginning of a Taiwanese identity. Okay. So finally, in 1895, during the waning days of the Qing Dynasty, the Manchurian Empire ceded Taiwan to Japan. This was a shock to the people living in Taiwan at the time because they were like, well, we didn't know that you owned us. You know, they just thought that it just wasn't right that they just be given over to Japanese because they weren't Japanese and they weren't actually, they wanted to establish their own identity. And so they thought maybe if we make our own parliament and, you know, declare our own republic, then they'll recognize us. And so they did. They made Formosa Republic of Taiwan. This is the flag. This is the image of the first cabinet meeting. So they actually had representatives that met. This is the Japanese coming into Taipei City. And what happened basically was, as when the Japanese actually came, all these leaders got cold feet and left. And so it was very short, and the republic did not last. But it was the beginning of okay, we're Taiwanese and we're Taiwanese. We have a Taiwanese identity. Japan treated the Taiwanese very well. It was their first colony, and they wanted to make themselves like look good in front of the Western world. And so they wanted to look like, yeah, Western power, and they made Taiwan a model colony. They built up her infrastructure, did tons of agriculture and trade, built railroads, and the Taiwanese people were actually pretty educated during that time. However, they treated the Austronesian people of Taiwan very poorly because they needed the land that they owned for agriculture and trade. And this is an image of the Japanese fighting a Sedic tribe. This is the Sedic tribe. This is some leaders in the Sedic tribe. This is the leader, and they were initially very successful in fighting back the Japanese because they used guerrilla warfare tactics, and they knew the mountains, and these guys did not. But once they took out chemical warfare and used mustard gas, the last holdouts, they all either died or they actually committed a mass suicide rather than be taken over by the Japanese. So Taiwanese people in general have a very favorable view of the Japanese because they really built Taiwan up, but the Austronesian people really had a really bad experience. Okay, so this all changed at the end of World War II when Japan lost. Enter Chiang Kai-shek. So Chiang Kai-shek, you've probably all heard of him. He was head of the mafia in Shanghai, and his second wife was the daughter of the man who owned the biggest banking company in Shanghai. And so basically you got like muscle and money, muscle and money at the same time. He was super corrupt, which is probably the reason Mao won in China, because his specialty was stripping provinces bare of money. And they were really good at getting foreign national aid from the US because they, they're not fighting against communist China, right? And the US didn't see how corrupt they actually were, but a lot of the money they got didn't actually go towards weapons or fighting. It like got pocketed or put in the black market. Okay, so at the end of the war, he was a part of the Allied powers, so he was assigned to dispose of the Japanese troops as a representative of the Allied powers, not as a representative of the People's Republic of China. So the thing is, he didn't just do that. He seized Taiwan and established his dictatorship there instead of just kicking the Japanese out. And this is really key. Chiang Kai-shek pushed for Taiwan to be given to China, but the Americans refused to write that in the treaty. And so it's a multilateral treaty of peace with Japan, or also known as the San Francisco Treaty of 1951. The only thing specified was that Japan would give up sovereignty over Taiwan, not to whom Taiwan was going to be under. And so by international law, Taiwan should have been able to establish its own nation. But this didn't happen because of the Korean War and the Cold War. The Americans thought it would be expedient to let Chiang Kai-shek continue to control Taiwan. And so he did. So this happened in 1945. Chiang Kai-shek sent his governor general, he sent his governor general to go and take over Taiwan. And within 2 years of KMT occupation, Kuomintang KMT is the party name, Chiang Kai-shek's party name. Taiwan's economy just tanked. They basically destroyed everything the Japanese did. Their food was scarce. Again, they were specialized in stripping provinces of money, and that's what they did when they came to Taiwan. And people were just awful. And this is a comic of, basically, this is China and this is Taiwan, and it's saying that China, the corruption is like starting to infiltrate Taiwan. Okay, so in 1947, I think this guy is the Governor General, Chiang Kai-shek's Governor General. In 1947, something happened. Some military police came and roughed up an old lady that was selling cigarettes illegally. And that caused kind of a big scene. And finally people were like, they kind of woke up, they're like, this is corrupt, forget this, you're beating up an old lady. And we're like just barely trying to survive. That's why she was selling them in the black market, because she didn't have enough food. And they're like, this is corrupt, let's get rid of this. And so people from all over Taiwan rose up and they kicked out the military police, and they established provisional governments, and they had different leaders of these provisional governments. What happened was, and this is some of the outrage that happened during time, people gathering for that. Well, what happened is Chiang Kai-shek's Governor General, Chun Yi, pretended to negotiate with these leaders. What he was actually doing was taking down names. And on February 28th, 1947, Chiang Kai-shek's Governor General sent troops to Taiwan and literally shot their way down Taiwan. So they arrested the leaders of the provisional government, and those people disappeared. They were never seen again, and many people died. In order to save bullets, they would tie up 2 or 3 people and shoot one in the head, and then they would stand them next to the river, and then because of the weight of the dead person, they would drown. So bodies were washing up everywhere. And after this incident, called the 228 incident, martial law just was clamped down. It was called the White Terror. People disappeared all the time. There was no freedom of anything. People sacrificed their lives, and many people were, it was a really hard time. And martial law wasn't lifted officially until 1980, in the early 1980s. So it was on for a very long time. Even after Chiang Kai-shek died, his son took over and he continued the martial law. This is an engraving done to commemorate 228, just to show how awful that time was. And this is a painting someone did to show the mass graves that people still find today. Like when people are, contractors are digging foundations for buildings, often they will still find mass graves of people who just died during that time. And you want to share something real quick?
Yeah, I guess I should get yeah. So my host dad, my third host dad, one named Laser, he told me about this, the 228 incident, because his family had a story where they were involved with this. His grandfather actually was one of the people killed in this massacre, leaving his father and his father's family, so all his siblings, orphans at the time. I don't remember what happened to his mom, but I don't think she was in the picture. So because of all this, my host dad, like he was always railing on the Chinese, like they were bandits, that they were evil, because the hurt goes really, really deep. I even asked him, because I was, curious, because we had a really good relationship. He was this most doting host father I could have ever hoped for. And I asked him, what would happen if I were Chinese? Would you still have treated me with the same generosity that you have? And it shocked me, but he dead paused for a good minute and finally said, no, probably not, because of the degree of the weight of what this incident did to the Taiwanese people. And it's not just my host dad either. It was most people I talked to, especially in the area I was living in. It's farther from the capital. There's more Chinese influence in the capital than there are throughout the rest of Taiwan. They're all very patriotic, where they would say, don't call me Chinese, I'm Taiwanese. And it's a big deal. You want to be a little careful if you accidentally call someone Chinese in Taiwan. So, I guess.
So, yeah. Another important thing to note, this is just in this, during this period, in 1972, the UN gave China a seat, for Communist China a seat, and the ambassador of the UN at the time, George H.W. Bush, actually offered Chiang Kai-shek a Taiwan seat, and Chiang Kai-shek refused it, and he walked out. And because of that, Taiwan does not have a representation in the UN. And it still does not to this day. Okay, so there were many movements during the White Terror period, people really pushing for democracy and freedom. And one of these movements in 1979 was of a magazine, Linton, or Formosa magazine. And this magazine was undercover magazine. You would have like an old lady selling flowers, and if you knew the right words, she'd like pass you a magazine under kind of thing. It was a huge network under that. And they organized a huge protest, peaceful protest, against the government, and so many people came up that they had to bring in that the regime was very scared, and they brought in police and they immediately started arresting people. Some of the people that were going to trial, these people are going to prison from the arrest during that time. They arrested everyone involved, including my grandfather, and I'm just going to share kind of our personal story with what happened then. My grandfather was a lawyer who had advised the magazine, so he wasn't integrally involved in it. He was a very prominent politician, so they couldn't have their own political party, but he was one of those leaders that people looked up to. And so my mom says that one day she just woke up and he wasn't there. He'd been taken to prison, but they didn't tell him that. They didn't tell her that. They told her that he just like went off to do military duty or something. But they came and took him in the night. And the political prisoners were often, and he was tortured to sign confession letters that they were communists to make them look bad. So they did that, but they tortured them, and because of this torture, my grandfather's mom called Amnesty International and was about that. Well, they had the phone tapped, and they figured out that she called, and so what happened was on the anniversary of the 228 February 28th massacre in 1980, they decided to make an example of my family, my grandfather's family, and wipe out his bloodline. So they actually sent an assassin to my mom's house during broad daylight, and this house was under 24-hour police surveillance. And so obviously it was a political maneuver, so they sent an assassin. It's broad daylight. My mom remembers that she had her school's right next to her house. So she just walked back home to get lunch, and this Chinese man opened the door. And she didn't think of any of it. They had a lot of guests. And so she went to her room, and he came after her and stabbed her. And if she hadn't had her backpack on and like blocked it, she would have died. But she was stabbed, and her grandmother, so my grandfather's mom, was at the time at a grocery store when he came back. When she came back, he killed her. And she had two twin sisters. And my mom at this time was about 8 years old, so they would have been, I think, 6 years old. And they were both killed as well. And the doctors had been ordered not to operate on anyone during 228, the anniversary. So it took a long time for the doctors to decide to operate on my mom, but they eventually did, and that really saved her life, and she was in the hospital for several months. My grandmother, so my grandfather's wife, at the time was visiting my grandfather in prison, and so she was not there. So this was meant to terrorize the Taiwanese people into submission. What it actually did is it backfired, because people woke up and they realized this is awful that you would kill a old lady and like innocent little girls. And because of this, and God really used it for good, people began to speak up more and fight against the oppressive dictatorship. And eventually, I can't go into detail about this, but over the years, different peaceful political movements like that followed after Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., peaceful protests, human civil rights movements, human rights movements. Eventually, Taiwan in 2000 was able to elect the first pro-Taiwan president, the Democratic People's Party, Taiwan, and it was the first peaceful transfer of power from the KMT to a pro-Taiwan authority. Okay. So, current situation, Taiwan is still very dependent on the US and other foreign nations. It's not strong enough to defend itself in many ways. And so actually this upcoming election in the US will, if Biden becomes president, Taiwan is actually in a lot of danger because the Chinese. They kind of watch America regarding how they act on Taiwan, and they've been pointing to, I mean, they have missiles pointed at us. They've always had missiles pointed at us. And so if we have a weak president who's not going to stand up to China, Taiwan is in a lot of danger still. And the good thing is that people do have a sense of Taiwanese identity now, and so they're willing to push for that, but they don't really have the resources. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And these are just books I highly recommend. This talks more about the White Terror period. This is just overview, and this is just like Taiwan culture from a missionary that went there and really integrated into it. So, yeah, that's what I'm doing.